Heads up, freeze out. All right, Marco, cut that part. I think that you're. Let's just start the hand over.
Hand of the day.
Today's hand of the day is brought to you by 888 Poker. What's up, guys? It's Alec, Torelli, and welcome to an episode of the hand of the day. Gonna try something a little different here in these episodes. I'm gonna be watching the hand in real time as I'm playing, giving you guys some live commentary about my thoughts. And I wanted to stop and take a minute and tell you, if you want more of the math aspect of this and really understanding how I make complex and deep decisions like the one in this video, check out my blog, alectorelli.com. I'm gonna talk about the math in this video, but on my blog, I go a lot more into the details of things that I don't want to bore you with in a fun, short YouTube video. So if you want to see screenshots of Poker Scope and really the exact hand range I put my opponents on, the exact odds we're getting, and how I break down these tough analytical spots, including some of the post hand review that I do after my poker sessions, I encourage you to check that out. I'll put a link right below this video, but for now, let's get to today's episode of the hand of the day. So today's hand comes from Eric. He's playing a heads up freeze out on PokerStars, and he's about 200 big blinds deep. So it's very, very deep stacks in this game here. And we're on the button with 9-4 offsuit. Decide to min raise to 80 on 20-40 blinds. Our opponent 3-bets to 240, and we call. Before we go to the flop, let's stop and take a minute and analyze just the pre-flop play here. I think opening is fine. It's on the looser side, and I would adjust my opening range here depending on the tendency of my opponent in the big blind. So in the beginning of the match, I would probably open almost all of my hands, and this would be one of the worst hands I would open, and I would sort of see how my opponent reacts, especially when we're 200 big blinds deep. Is he 3-betting me a lot? If he's 3-betting a ton, I might tighten up on the button or start limping or open less, and this might be one of the hands that I consider folding. If he's calling a lot and he plays very bad or straightforward post-flop and he's not very aggressive, I would definitely be opening this hand. I don't mind raising a little bit bigger when you're deep stacked. If you're 200 big blinds deep, you could even go as big as 3x, so you could make it 120 instead of 80 in this spot. Again, a lot depends on the tendencies of your opponent. If he's going to 3-bet a lot, I like a min raise a lot better. It gives you a lot better price on your 3-bet, and it keeps the pot smaller, so it really punishes him if he decides to 3-bet, because you're very deep stacked and you're in position and you could afford to call and take the flop with a wide range of hands. So I don't mind opening here. Again, a lot depends on your opponent, but calling a 3-bet is a little bit questionable. Pretty much regardless of your opponent, I wouldn't really call a 3-bet with this hand, frankly. I think calling with suited is like one of the worst hands I would call with. And if you feel like you have to call because you're being too exploited if you fold too often, or your opponent is 3-betting you too much, I think there are some adjustments that you can make, like the ones I talked about before. Maybe you try limping, maybe you open less, maybe you mix in limping and opening, maybe you open bigger. But I think calling with bad hands isn't the adjustment that you need to be making, right? Just because he's being overly aggressive, you shouldn't compensate for him being too loose by being too loose yourself, because then what you're doing is you're essentially cutting down the strength of hands that you're playing versus your opponent, and so you're like allowing him to 3-bet you more often by incorporating these very, very poor, trashy hands into your calling range. So I would just like to see you fold here and wait for the next hand, and again, consider making those adjustments that we talked about. That being said, you decided to call. I would probably fold this hand, and then like some of the time, if my opponent was 3-betting way too often, I might 4-bet. I probably wouldn't 4-bet with this hand, but just in general, that's another adjustment you can make if your opponent is 3-betting too often. Mix that in, see how he reacts, and then go from there. Let's take this hand to the flop. Flop comes Queen Jack 4, rainbow, and now our opponent bets half the pot. So in this spot, given that we already got to the flop with this hand, we have to decide how we're going to go about and proceed, right? I mean, I said I would have folded pre-flop, but if I find myself in this spot on the flop, if I did call, I would definitely call the flop here and take one off. I think, it's not a great flop for you. This board did connect some with your opponent, but you're only calling a half pot bet. You're in position. You have almost all your 2-pair outs are going to be live. Of course, if you hit trips, you're definitely going to have the best hand, like almost 100% of the time. And there's a good chance you have the best hand now. You also have a lot of room to play this pot in position. You could maybe turn your hand into a bluff on a later street. You could represent some cards, and you might just have the best hand. Your opponent also might shut down here, depending on a lot of blank turns. I mean, your hand is sort of protected here when you call, in the sense that a lot of the times you're going to have queens and jacks in your range, which is a large part of the range of the button who's calling a 3-bet preflop. In other words, the times that you call a 3-bet preflop, the queen and the jack hit your hand a lot. So it's going to be scary for the big blind to continue barreling, because it's so likely that you have a piece of this board when you call, and you could call a bet on the turn. So I like calling here. This is one of the worst hands you're going to call the flop with. Of course, besides like gut shots or something like that. But I mean, this is like not a super premium hand to call with. But I think if you balance that out by calling with really strong hands, like, anytime you have a queen or better, 2-pair or set, whatever, it's going to be very hard for your opponent to bluff you profitably here. So I like calling the flop, and pretty standard, go ahead to the turn. Turn comes an offsuit king, so a completely rainbow board here, and our opponent bets half the pot again. Now, I know we're getting great odds here, and we only need 25% equity to justify calling when he bets half the pot, but this is a very, very bad card for our range. So this is the one point in the hand where I would consider folding. If not pre-flop, maybe consider folding on the turn. If I had something like 10-4, I would definitely call, because the times that we're behind, we have so much more equity, but like 9-4 is pretty rough. I mean, you have to ask yourself how often he's 3-betting you pre-flop to understand what his possible range is for bluffs on the turn. Think about that sentence again. To figure out the percentage of the time that your opponent is bluffing you here on the turn, and this goes into what we're going to talk about on the river, you have to figure out how often your opponent is 3-betting you pre-flop to begin with, right? If he's only 3-betting you with like Broadway cards and low suited connectors, then I really don't like this hand. It's unlikely that low suited connectors are going to like continue bluffing. I mean, maybe he's going to bluff and represent a king, but if he's the type of player that doesn't 3-bet a lot pre-flop, his range is going to be like very linear. He's going to have a lot of Broadway hands, very, very strong hands, and you're just crushed against this range. So you really have to hope that your opponent has a light 3-betting range pre-flop, and the hands that are double barreling are going to be hands that have like suited rundowns, like 10-8, 10-7, 9-7, something like that. I mean, you block one of the nines, but or it's going to have like ace-x. You're really hoping that he has ace-x here. Ace-x is a great hand for him to continue bluffing with. He has some equity, and he also can represent a king a lot easier than you on the turn. The king is a very great card for his range. It's a very bad card for your range. So his range is still stronger than yours, and that's important to keep in mind. That means he's very, very likely to bet with all of his holdings. Even if he has a complete bluff, he might still go ahead and bet with it. So it's hard to make a decision on the turn here unless you know a little bit about your opponent, and you know exactly, not exactly, but have you a good idea of how likely it is he's going to be 3-betting you pre-flop, and with what hands he's going to be doing that with. Of course, you also want to know like how often he's going to c-bet the flop, and is he going to represent this card on the turn. So knowing a little bit about the tendencies of your opponent really helps you make a decision here on the turn in spots like these. You are getting a great price. You're faced in a tough spot on a decent amount of rivers, but it's tough to give up your equity when you only need 25% to justify calling. This is the one spot I would consider folding. I know I'm giving sort of vague answers, but a lot depends on what I know about my opponent in general. So I encourage you to like use all the time that you're not playing these specific hands to lead you to make the right decision in this hand. If this was like the first hand I was ever playing with someone against a normal opponent that I just thought had a decent 3-betting range and that wasn't hyper aggressive, I would probably just let this go here on the turn. This is a really, really bad card for me. Even though he's likely to continue bluffing with all his bluffs, this card really connected with a lot of his range. So I would probably let this one go and move on to the next hand. Now we move on to the river. The river comes in offsuit 6. The pot is 2,000, and our opponent bets pretty much half pot, a little bit over half pot. again, we're pretty much in the same exact spot that we're in on the turn. So if we concluded on the turn that there's enough bluffs in our opponent's range pre-flop, there's enough times that he's going to be bluffing on the flop and on the turn, if he has all of the ace-x combinations, which is really what we're hoping that he bluffs with here, it's unlikely he's going to run a no equity bluff, right? Like, it's unlikely he's going to just keep barreling with 7-8 suited. It takes a particular type of opponent to do that, and if you have that type of opponent that's just going to represent strong hands at all costs, fine, maybe you can consider going ahead and making a loose call here against this guy. But if you're playing against a normal opponent that's only going to bluff with equity, and he's just like a little bit tighter or a little bit more run-of-the-mill average type of opponent, I think in this spot, you have to put him on a hand that has some sort of equity if he missed. So you're really hoping he has like those ace-x type hands, and you really have to ask yourself the same types of questions you asked on the turn, like how likely is it that he's going to continue repping this story? I think if you find yourself in this spot on the river, I would probably call the river here. If I called the turn with the logic that we talked about, thinking that he's bluffing enough of the time, this river didn't really change anything. His range is still stronger than yours. If he was running a big bluff, it's unlikely he's going to shut down on the river because it just doesn't really make sense to bet twice and give up in this spot if you're him. I think it's like just so likely that you have something like a queen or a jack, and it's really unlikely that you have any kings in your range, right? Like the only kings you could have are something like king 10, king 9, king jack, king queen. You never have ace king. It's, you know, I mean, it's just like hard for you to have a king. So I think anytime he has a king, he's going to value bet, which adds more strong hands into his range. But at the same time, I think this is a great card for him to bluff and try and get you to fold a queen, a jack, or like a small pocket pair, something like 2 8s or something. So the times he has bluffs, I think he's going to bluff. And if you determined, based on his pre-flop tendencies and the way he plays post-flop, that he's going to be bluffing enough of the time on the flop and the turn, then he's probably going to continue with that line on the river, and the logic for you is the exact same. You're pretty much in the exact same spot. You're getting the same price. You only need to be correct about 25% of the time to justify calling here. And this is a spot where I really, after the hand, would use a poker program called Poker Stove or Poker Cruncher, and I would plug in all the hands that I think he could have, plug in my hand, and figure out my exact equity. I show you all that in the process I use on my blog, alectorelli.com. So click the link below this video and you can check that out in a lot more detail after the hand. But in short, I did run the numbers. I'll give you the summary here. I think this hand is a call. I think if you give him all of those ace-x combos I talked about, if he has like a decent bluffing range here on the river, you're going to be winning this hand about 50% of the time. I know that sounds like ambitious to be winning 50%, but even if you cut his bluffs in half, you're still going to have enough equity to justify calling here. So he would have to be like a very, very tight opponent to fold here on the river. And you know, if you're playing against that type of opponent, you probably would have folded pre-flop or on the turn. So if you got to the river because you reason that your opponent's bluffing too much, he's going to rep this card, and you know you're too exploitable if you fold because your hand is very, very weak here, fine, you could go ahead and call. So that's my thoughts on this hand. I think the case for folding is definitely pre-flop. I think that's like much more clear cut. The turn is a little bit more ambiguous. And I think this hand is one of those spots where it's really, really important to know your opponent. This is like a spot where like it might be a clear call versus someone and like a completely trivial fold versus someone else. I suppose that's what makes poker so unique and dynamic, is that no two hands are the same because no two opponents are the same. So I'm going to assume with you that you understand enough about your opponent that you know he's going to be taking advantage of all of these types of situations, in which case his bluffing frequency is going to be high enough that you can like justify calling here. So those are my thoughts on this hand. Again, know your player, because that's ultimately what's going to lead you to making a profitable call or a profitable fold. All right, guys, that's it for the hand of the day. Subscribe to my channel if you like this video. Please share it with someone you think would like it as well. And I'm putting out a lot more new content coming up, so send me your hands. If you guys want to be featured on the show, on my website, alectorelli.com, you can click on poker and submit your hands, and you can send them to me. I'll take the best ones and review them here on my channel. I'll see you guys next week for the hand of the day. Thanks for watching. Cheers.